My rant today, my daily rant today, and it's one of the better ones over at HartmannReport.com. There's nothing normal about having a middle class. It has to be chosen, is the headline. And it's true, the American middle class has collapsed. We're heading in the direction of looking like the 19th century England that Charles Dickens wrote about in his novels. 5 years ago, the American middle class ceased to be more than half of us. We went from 2/3 of Americans being in the middle class when Ronald Reagan was elected in 1980 to 49% in 2015. I'm sorry I don't have current numbers for this. That was the last time that Pew did a really in-depth study on it. Presumably it's less than 49% now. But NPR commemorated that 5 years ago with the headline, quote, "The tipping point. Most Americans no longer are middle class." This year, we just got some new statistics, actually just last week, from the U.S. Census and the Fed that show that for the first time in American history, for the first time in my lifetime, the share of wealth held by the top 1% of Americans has exceeded the share of wealth held by the 49% of Americans who are, quote, middle class. The headline over at Bloomberg from a couple of days ago, top 1% of U.S. earners now hold more wealth than all of the American middle class. Which raises the question, how do you get a middle class? Most people think that capitalism just produces a middle class, right? You've got, captains of industry who build factories, and people go to work in those factories or those retail stores or those whatever it may be, and they get paid a salary, and that salary turns them into nice middle-class consumers. Not how it works. That's how it works in a regulated, taxed capitalist economy. But that's not how it works in an unregulated, neoliberal, low-tax capitalist economy, which is what we've had since 1981. Having a middle class is a choice that we have to make as a society. We have to decide. In 1980, Reagan decided no more middle class. It's pesky, it's problematic, it's a pain in the ass. And there's a reason for that, by the way. The reason that Reagan decided that we have to do away with the middle class, and just think about what America was like, if you're old enough to remember this, or if you've read any history books, in 1980, when Ronald Reagan was elected, it was the tail end of 20 years of movements in the United States, social movements that started in the 60s in a big way. There was the civil rights movement, the voting rights movement, the labor movement, the environmental movement. I mean, in fact, we could go back, the civil rights movement kind of crescendoed in 1964 and 65 with the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act. But it was the result of movement politics, largely driven by people like the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. You had the women's movement, which came out of the birth control pill being legalized in 1961, being in widespread use by 1965. Out of that came, women saying, hey, wait a minute, now I can control my fertility. I want to be in the workplace. So we had, this discarding of the old idea of the woman as the housewife. Louise and I last weekend were just looking for something dumb to watch on TV, and the TV we have in the bedroom is a Roku TV, and they were advertising Bewitched. Remember Samantha, it was Elizabeth Montgomery, and Dick York, and so we watched a couple episodes of Bewitched, and it was like this kind of window into another time and another world where she's trying to be a housewife, right? That's her job. That's what women did in the early 60s in our society. Well, women said, no, I want to be part of the labor force. And by the 70s, we had this huge women's movement in the United States. Ralph Nader wrote a book called Unsafe at Any Speed, which kicked off in 1965, which kicked off a major, actually that was 67, 65 was Silent Spring. But anyhow, that kicked off a major consumer movement in the United States. That's what provoked Lewis Powell to write his memo. He cites Nader in the memo by name. And then you had, in 1965, you had Silent Spring, published by Rachel Carlson. If I'm remembering my years right, it was certainly in the 60s, both of them. And that kicked off the environmental movement in the United States, which led a decade later to Richard Nixon signing legislation creating the Environmental Protection Agency. So in 1980, when Reagan came into office, we had 20 years of young people in the streets, workers in the streets, environmentalists in the streets, consumers in the streets, and the rich people in America and the big corporations, they were over it. They were like, no more, no mas. This is what happens when you have a strong middle class, because in the 60s and 70s, we had the strongest middle class the world had ever seen, the United States had ever seen. And it had grown as a result of high tax rates at the top, so the rich people, rather than taking all the money out of their corporation, which is what they do now, had to leave it in the corporation. Otherwise, hey, why pay 91% income tax, right? So they left it in the corporation, and the corporation used that money to pay decent wages. And you had a strong labor movement. So Reagan came into office and said, we don't want any more of these movements, right? This has just been tearing America apart from the conservative point of view. Keep in mind, conservative means we're here for the rich. Always been that way, right? Whether it was the conservatives in the 1770s who were opposed to separating from England, or people like David Hume, the British conservative historian, who Jefferson liked to trash every opportunity he had, or whether it was people like John C. Calhoun in the 1800s, who were advocates for slavery and oligarchy, or whether it's, the right-wing fossil fuel billionaires today. They are always advocates for oligarchy, for their own class, and they're always opposed to a middle class. Well, how do you get rid of the middle class? How do you get rid of those pesky people in the streets who are hassling us all? Easy. Cut their wages. Move them from the middle class into the working poor. And they will no longer feel brave enough on college campuses to protest because, hey, now they've got $100,000 in student debt. They will no longer feel brave enough to go on strike at their place of work because, hey, there's all kinds of scabs and the laws have changed and we can bust the labor unions. I could go through every single one of the movements, but you get my point. So we chose in 1933 with Franklin Roosevelt to build the first really substantial American middle class. And we accomplished that by the 1970s. And we did it through regulating the economy by things like allowing labor unions, saying, sorry, corporations, you cannot destroy labor unions. So regulation and taxation. And we did it by taxing the very rich at 91%. So that, after, now it's a tax bracket, right? Your 91% taxes didn't even kick in until you were making more than about $3 million in today's money, which is why most CEOs made under $3 million right up until the 1980s. And now, of course, we got a bumper crop of billionaires, which just drains all that money out of the middle class and throws it into the money bins of the top 1%. Who now own more wealth than the entire American middle class combined. So, do you want a middle class back? I mean, this is the question that we need to be asking ourselves. There is no discussion of this in public that I know of. I've been writing about this for years. I mean, this is the basis of my 2005 book, Screwed. I've written, at least once a year I write an op-ed about it. This year, it's today's over at HartmannReport.com. That middle classes don't normally emerge in capitalism. What you have instead is Charles Dickens' world. You have a small number of very, very rich people at the top. That would be the royal family and their friends, and the House of Lords, the industrialists of 19th century, 1800s England that Dickens wrote about. They weren't even in A Christmas Story. Then you have a small middle class, which is basically the managerial class and the professional class, the doctors, the lawyers, the company managers, and the small entrepreneurs, the small businesses. That's the middle class. That's what Scrooge was. In A Christmas Carol, in Dickens's book, he was the middle class. And they were a very small slice. You had a 1% who were very wealthy, you had a 1 or 2% who were the middle class, and then you had this 95% plus that were the working poor. That was Bob Cratchit and his son, Tiny Tim. And that is what's normal. That's how when capitalism is not regulated and taxes on the rich are not high, That's what you get. And that's the direction we've been heading ever since 1981. Now, we can make a choice. We can keep heading in that direction, or we could start the process of reversing it, which is exactly what Biden's Build Back Better bill does, by starting to raise taxes on the super rich to pay for it. And we're not even raising them back to where they were before Trump came into office. But it's a start. Do we want a middle class? Nobody is framing this question in this context, to the best of my knowledge, and everybody should be, because that's what's at stake here.